Lyder. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. And Mr. Vice President, we have been called here to Parliament today to debate and act to provide for the designation, development, and operation and management of the special economic zones, the establishment of the Economic Zones Authority, and the repeal of the Free Zones Act, Chapter 8107, the regulation of special economic zones and matters related to thereto. And Mr. Vice President, I listened to the Honourable Minister of Trade and Industries as she brought this bill, piloted this bill, and also listened to the Honorable Minister West in her delivery this evening. And I asked myself, and I wondered whether this should have been a bill piloted by the Honorable Attorney General or the Honorable Minister of Finance. Because in this bill, for the Attorney General, once again, it's an opportunity to tick the box for money laundering, tax leakages, rules and regulations, compliance, and all of these things, Mr. Vice President. And we see nothing really substantial coming out to support the aims and objectives of economic development. I heard my colleague, Senator John, speak at length about this, so I won't repeat. But when we look at the core focus of the Special Economic Zones Authority, it can be gleaned from the overarching government specialized economic zones policy. This legislation was birthed from the Special Economic Zones policy as it informs us as legislatures as to why specific measures, licenses, penalties, and rewards have been proposed here. And the core tenet of the Special Economic Zones policy should really be to attract foreign direct investment, boost exports, and diversify our economy. So I will demonstrate, Mr. Vice President, in my presentation that notwithstanding the clauses of this bill, the government's track record does not instill confidence in the ability to deliver on the aims and objectives of this proposed law. Mr. Vice President, when we look at, for instance, Clause 5, and I read 5 subsection 1, it gives the indication as to the failures of the government in economic diversification. Specifically, subsection 8 states that the authority will be required to, and I quote, develop modern infrastructure required to attract foreign direct investment and stimulate domestic investment. Now, let us dissect this statement for a moment here, Mr. Vice President. This is a call for modern infrastructure. In the schedules of the bill, industrial parks are included here, likely the e-tech parks. Under this government, Mr. Vice President, there are almost about close to 24 industrial parks. And by and large, Mr. Vice President, one only has to look at it to see the disrepair that these parks are in today. And I could take any member from this Senate into the industrial estate where one of my businesses are. And you could go on any given day and see a herd of cows walking through the industrial estate freely. And I ask myself, how does this type of a facility, how will this kind of a facility encourage foreign direct investment, especially as when you speak about manufacturing of food products, Mr. Vice President? I mean, along with that, Mr. Vice President, you can see water trucks coming from the outside of the estate, coming in and illegally hooking up to fire hydrants and taking water out illegally. Now, I looked in the yellow books, Mr. Vice President, and I saw what was the money that was set aside for maintenance of these parks that will now fall under this special economic zone. And there, Mr. Vice President, I saw approximately $2 million that was set aside. And we saw that of this $2 million, this is for new fire hydrants across these estates. And I wonder whether or not this investment now is going to be for the benefit of these trucks coming in outside illegally. I don't mean to be facetious about it, but this is what goes on a day-to-day basis. Mr. Vice President, subsection I speaks to promoting economic development in local communities. But the major issue in terms of the economic development is security. Mr. Vice President, there has been countless cases of crime, robberies, break-ins in many of these estates that may now form part of this new authority, economic zone. And so I ask myself, how does that encourage foreign direct investment into this country? We look, and especially when we look at subsection J, Mr. Vice President, which speaks about advancing further diversification of the economy. Now, I asked myself, I looked at the decline in the manufacturing of just over 16% between 2015 and 2020, right? And so therefore, this government's policy and agenda has not resulted in positive outcomes for domestic manufacturers. So this said, the evidence is clear that despite belatedly bringing a trade policy in 2019, And in this special economic zone policy, as a subset of the overarching trade policy, this government has failed miserably at economic expansion. So how do we expect anything different here? I certainly didn't hear anything here that encourages me to think differently. I mean, the decline in manufacturing from 2015, when it was $13.7 billion and a decline of over $5 billion, speaks to the government's failure at diversifying the economy. So if this government is not prepared, Mr. Vice President, to invest the right amount of money into the infrastructure and providing funds for these parks to help with security, with flood alleviation, with issues with utilities, then we are going nowhere. We are not going to attract the investment that I hear the Honourable Minister of Trade speak about today. And we're not going to boost output, and we're not going to boost exports if this is the case. So, Mr. Vice President, I move on to Clause 7. And I heard that the Minister went at length to speak about in Clause 7, subsection 2, she spoke about, the Honourable Minister spoke about how the Board of Directors was constituted. And I wish to point out a shortcoming coming from my experience as a career businessman in this country, Mr. Vice President. So we heard the Honourable Minister speak about the 11 members, those who are the CEO, public servants, attorneys, etc. But there are now 6 posts that have to be filled. And the qualifications that we see for those 6 posts is someone who comes, or a professional who comes from a business organization, but no position that is mandatory for a business owner. So therefore, the organization, the SEC authority, will not intentionally seek out business owners, people who are stakeholders in industry, have skin in the game. You see, Mr. Vice President, it was in consultation with the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association that we understood that they have been clamoring for years for a position on the board of ETEC, for example. And for some time, and they have been pushing to have a representative on there to be able to deal with the interest of the tenants inside of there. So there's no businessman on the SEC Authority Board, and not just a businessman, but one who is a tenant in the parks and understands the issue. So through you, Mr. Vice President, to the Honourable Minister of Trade, as a result, to strengthen the role of the authority, I wish to table the following amendment to Section 7, subsection 2, as new Part F, where 2 additional board members are to be added based on the following, and I will quote: a representative of an association of industrial park tenants who is a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago and a business owner. Where there is no representative association, the individual chosen shall be a significant shareholder of an enterprise based in the industrial parks in Trinidad and Tobago. And secondly, let's listen to the TTMA. A representative of the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association who also is a business owner. So I am going to forward this amendment for the consideration in committee stages, and let's get it right this time, Mr. Vice President. When we look at Clause 21, subsection 1, it outlines how economic zones shall raise their finances. So Part D under this subsection speaks to the collection of revenue via, and I quote, fees, dues, charges, or other monies collected for the grant of licenses to operate or SEC enterprises and single zone enterprises. Now, this brings a concern to the fore for me. And when we look at some of these estates today, where there are persons who have land unoccupied at this point in time, who may have come in when it was a peppercorn rates, but now there are new persons who have come into the estate who are paying much higher rates. And we are seeing now that the annual rates or leases coming from ETEC, for instance, is starting to climb. Every 5 years they review it, and it is going closer and closer towards the high rates of those on the open market. So I'm just simply stating that it has to be an incentivized framework to enter into these special economic zones. Because my question would be, why would someone pay rates in a far-flung special economic zone when they could pay the same rates in a private sector warehouse on the open market close to a port, where this private warehouse will have much better amenities, good roads, lights, water, not water cutting off for 3 days when we saw the desalination plant collapse. So, Mr. Vice President, this section speaks to the collection of fees as outlined, and as a result, I wish to caution the government to include in this section some sort of a caveat that fees in the special economic zone should be lower than on the open market. This will incentivize investors to enter these special economic zones and to ensure that the tenants that are there would remain there. I think I heard the Honourable Minister West speak somewhat about fees. So in the Honourable Minister's wrap-up, I saw Mr. Vice President and the Minister took some notes, so I'm sure the Honourable Minister will respond to that. But as we look to Part 7, licensing provisions, Clause 32, types of licenses, the Minister spoke very clearly about the various types of licenses and spoke about the 3 types of licenses, which are the operating license, the special economic zone enterprise license, or the single zone enterprise license. So there is a set distinction that the Minister explained, Honourable Minister explained, between operators and enterprises. But when we look at Schedule 4 to the bill, it outlines the criteria to obtain a license. And I heard the Honourable Minister West, as well as Senator Timal, speak about the quantum of persons or so that are mandated to be in the zones, etc., and whether they are local or foreign or whatnot. But there is a bothersome Section 4 under the eligibility criteria for a single zone enterprise. And it states that the number of full-time employees physical, and this is the language, physical, present in the zone must be in excess of 50 persons. And one would have thought that we had learned some lessons from this global pandemic, Mr. Vice President, with remote working being a trend, that the legislation would have reflected the same, Mr. Vice President. So I'd like to propose an amendment that the language does not require 50+ staff to be physically present in the zone. Rather, it should call for 50+ staff to be physically located or actively located in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So this will cover both categories of workers, whether working in person in the zone or whether remotely from your home. And given that the Special Economic Zones policy speaks to modernizing the free zone legislation, this amendment would indeed modernize the workplace expectations of a modern labor force.
That's a suggested amendment, or are you going to put it in writing?
Yes, I'll put it in writing, Mr. Vice President, while ensuring job creating exists locally. Mr. Vice President, I now turn to Clause 38 and 39, and I saw that Senator John sort of brisked past it. I would like to go a little more in detail and connect it to the ease of doing business, Mr. Vice President. When we look at Clauses 38 and 39 in the bill, it outlines the role of the minister when it comes to granting or refusing an operator license, as well as transferring the license to another operator. And, the issue that arises here is that the minister has to be called in to grant a license to an operator. The role of a politician, Mr. Vice President, and a member of the cabinet should be to form policy and create an enabling environment for the private sector. And I'm not speaking about that of e-tech and so, but I'm speaking specifically about private operators here. Yet we see that the minister will be in a position to directly impact which enterprises are successful or not in becoming operators. You see, this opens the door for interference from the political directorate, and this, Mr. Vice President, is highly unnecessary. Given, when you think that a politician can have close friends and financiers that can have an advantage over the competition who may not necessarily be in the inner circle of the government, that raises a concern. And in fact, if the institution, that is the Special Economic Zone Authority, has a full board properly installed, constituted, with senior management in place, then what possible technical value, respectfully, can a minister of government bring in deciding which business is suitable or which business is not for an operator? So the minister also has a role under Clause 39 to choose who gets the transfer license. So again, this is unnecessary. This means that an operator can find a suitable successor, have it okayed with the technical experts at the SEC authority, get board sign-off, but have their transition process in limbo because they are waiting for a politician to decide. So this is an wholly untenable situation that swings the door wide open for political interference into the process. So, Mr. Vice President, even if the government will argue that this is something that existed before, we have to know now that after 59 years of independence, 59 years and 3 months to be exact, of independence, we have to have the faith in the institutions and the citizens that occupy those seats in the institutions to allow for them to go through this process. And let me remind the government here today that foreign direct investors tend to shy away from when there's too much of political interference into any entity in a private sector. That is a fact. I mean, one only has to look at Venezuela and see what's happening there. But furthermore, when we go on to now clauses 51, 52, and 53, just like we saw in clauses 38 and 39 for the operators, we now see that this bill proposes for the enterprises to obtain their license and to transfer them, the minister again must come and approve. So we see that. Why is it so? I mean, imagine an enterprise in the zone having decided to sell its interest in a prospective investor for, an entity engaging, I don't know, manufacturing in tobacco, beverages, cosmetics, whatever. The SEC authority staff would have conducted their due diligence, Mr. Vice President. If they did not, there are clauses that will treat with them in the event of some negligence or corruption that's taking place. Yet the minister must still approve of the handover of such a license. I mean, let's just say for argument's sake, I'm a businessman, Mr. Vice President. Let's say I exist in this zone. I want to sell my entity, and I'm an opposition senator who challenges respectfully the minister, Honorable Minister of Trade. Do I have to wink, take a little wink, walk, and I don't mean this Minister of Trade, any Minister of Trade now or in the future. Do I have to walk behind the president's chair and say, hey, I'll be a good boy from now on. I'm not going to raise no voice. I'm not going to challenge you. Just approve it for me now. Or could I be open to political victimization by some minister? I cast no aspersions against the current Minister of Trade or so. But we are making bills for the future, Mr. Vice President. So there will be many persons there. And furthermore, the ability to exit or liquidate a position is a factor in ease of doing business. If an investor does not see an easy format for exit, then it increases the risk of the position that they will take, especially for foreign direct investment. So this is a bad faith set of clauses, as it does not take into account the ease of doing business and the ultimate interest of the private sector in having separation from the private sector and the executive arm of the state. Mr. Vice President, the policy guiding this bill speaks to the ease of doing business. In other consultations with various chambers of commerce, ease of doing business became a major issue of conversation. And because you see, in the entire chain of manufacturing to export, the chambers raised issues from everything from once they get it to the factory gate, all the way through the port, customs excise, and to the export market. Now, many of these operators are acting efficiently. And something that might cost $5 at the factory gate sometimes ends up costing $25 due to the influences that exist between the factory gate and that at the export market. So, and that is pertaining to the ease of doing business. So this reduces the competitiveness of the domestic producers on the global stage. Therefore, clauses 51 to 53, like clauses 38 to 39, only add an additional layer of difficulty to the ease of doing business for investors, whether they are local or foreign. And Mr. Vice President, it's important that I anchor my concerns in the policy that has given birth to this legislation. This is because the SEC policy pointed to a continued slide of Trinidad and Tobago under this government as it pertains to the ease of doing business. They made a claim, and I quote, the use of the SEZ and other economic zones can be used as prototypes through which the government can develop and implement new measures to improve the ease of doing business in Trinidad and Tobago and to attract new investment. Now, this sounds all well and good in theory without appreciation for what actually occurs on the ground in terms of practices and agencies in this government. The record of this government, Mr. Vice President, in terms of the ease of doing business is indeed poor. There are broad challenges, and just a few of them we could think of: starting a business, obtaining electrical connection, accessing credit, obtaining statutory approvals for infrastructure, foreign exchange shortages, trading across borders, including at the ports and with inefficiencies, and collecting VAT refunds on a timely basis. So you see, these broad areas, when scrutinized in detail, show the failure of this government to fulfill its duty in creating an enabling environment and for businesses, which these SEC enterprises, by the way, let me remind you, and operators, will not be immune to these issues. So I move on, Mr. Vice President, when we talk about Clause 54, the operation plan sending an annual operation report to the authorities. This has to be an unbelievable directive to be given to the private sector. What is worse is that it's now being put in law. What serious investor would submit to have an operational plan with their details? And I would like to know if it is fine details. But who would want to do that for the upcoming year and send annually to public workers in this manner? There is a potential here for trade secrets to be exposed or plans to be exposed. This is not a retroactive issue, Mr. Vice President. This legislation calls for future plans to be sent to the enterprise. And how does this help to attract business? You know, what this type of legal requirement results in is a turnaround in the decline of the foreign direct investment. And I mean, we just have to look for the last 6 years. Based on the UN Conference of Trade and Development data, more than $10 billion in foreign direct investment outflows have left our shores under this government. So this legislative reporting constraint is a bureaucratic incursion into the affairs of business entities that is simply not needed. Already these entities will require to pay fees and dues to be part of this SEC. And what is even more troubling is enterprises will have to provide financial statements on an annual basis in a manner outlined in Clause 55, Section 2. Mr. Vice President, these accounts will be detailed and retrospective and provides the authority with very sensitive taxpayer information. This will give an organization with a politically appointed board sensitive tax information. If there is an issue of tax evasion and illicit trade, as I heard in the presentation, then there's a board of Inland Revenue, and then, of course, this revenue authority foisted upon the nation, coming soon. This is where employees should have security of tenure and not a politically appointed board of directors, as is proposed for the SEC authority. So this opens the door again for political interference and sensitive information entering the hand of competitors, and competitors who, Mr. Vice President, let's be fair, could be aligned to the current government of the day, right? In this case, this PNM government. So it is important to note that under Clause 60, the entity that is non-compliant can be suspended and have their licenses revoked. Also, Mr. Vice President, I spoke at length, I look at Clause 85, I spoke at length about potential for political interference, and the only avenue of redress for an enterprise or an operator where they are aggrieved by a decision of the authority, and by extension the Honourable Minister, is to appeal to the decision to the High Court. This is whether it pertains to refusal of grants or renew a license or suspension or revocation of an existing license. It seems adversarial to me. Yes, sir. Right. So why is there no avenue of mediation as an immediate step, such as maybe a tribunal, before we get to this expensive High Court? And also, we look Clause 56. When you think of the prior clauses on submitting future operations and financial statements, if you think that was onerous, we look at Clause 56 and realize that the drafters of this bill had to be completely at sea, Mr. Vice President, when it comes to the interests of investors. I heard the Honourable Minister of Trade speak about a 50-year lease for operators' license, but Clause 56 makes it clear that the SEC enterprise license or single zone enterprise license shall be valid for a period of not exceeding 5 years. 5 short years, Mr. Vice President. 5 years is shorter than the average typical loan that an operator in any industrial park in Trinidad and Tobago will take. In fact, the period it will take to recover, make a return on investment on capital expenditure far exceeds 5 years. So at minimum, and then we look at leases in the industrial parks, they're at minimum 30 years. So why 5 years for this license? So we are calling for an amendment to this for a minimum of 15 years and a maximum of 20 years in line with the average turnaround investment profitability in the course of doing business. Mr. Vice President, I want to speak a little bit about VAT and property tax exemptions as we see in Schedule 2. So, and I seek I seek a clarification. So when we look at Schedule 2 of this bill, it outlines the benefits of a SEC enterprise and single zone enterprise operating in specific zones. We see when it comes to VAT, the following is stated, and I quote, "Goods supplied to the zone shall be zero rated, and services provided by non-residents in zones shall be zero rated." And when it comes now to the property tax in specific zones, for example, in industrial, the SEC enterprises shall benefit from, and I quote, "exemptions from property tax obligation." Now, let me deal with first with the VAT exemption. So I would like for the opportunity of the Senate for the Minister to clarify the mechanics here. Because, as you would likely know, manufacturers across the length and breadth of this country are not exempt and are indeed obligated to pay VAT on the importation of raw materials and inputs into their production process. And I've been arguing ad nauseum and hearing the chambers of commerce shout out, and they've been clamoring for timely repayment of VAT refunds to manufacturers. And these VAT refunds are now piling up in the billions once again. So it is concerning to me that these new tenants, many of them likely to be foreigners, would be gaining an advantage over domestic manufacturers who have been investing in this country for years, creating employment, and who have to wait years to get back their VAT refunds. And as such, if it is indeed the case of this unfair advantage held by tenants in these special economic zones, then I call on the government to heed the advice of the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association, not only by them calling for VAT collected to be removed from the consolidated fund, but also call on them to discontinue the collection of VAT at the ports by customs and excise for manufacturers who are importing raw materials and inputs. We seek clarification on this. And as it pertains to the property tax, the same applies. Why should manufacturers in these economic zones be exempt from paying property tax on their properties and machinery? Especially when manufacturers who have invested millions of dollars in their factories and warehouses are now being mandated by this government to pay property tax. Does this unfair advantage not work against the policy set out here in the bill for diversification of the economy outside of the energy sector? All manufacturers should be exempt if you wish to boost output. And in addition, as recommended by the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association, as well as various chambers of commerce, we are calling for manufacturing equipment should not be used as part of the formula to calculate property tax. Mr. Vice President, I wanted to speak a little bit about the support measures and benefits and to ensure that some of the subsidies that are going to be granted in this bill does not impact or inflict on World Trade Organization rules, us being members. So we want to make sure that we don't want to go against that. I don't have the time to speak about that in this very short 30 minutes to deliver on a 90-page bill. So as I close, Mr. Vice President, we in the opposition have looked at this bill. We are cognizant of this government's failure to diversify the economy, boost exports, and attract foreign direct investment. But if the government does not fix some of the issues I've addressed, as well as some of the other issues that my colleagues will speak about, then we will continue seeing this government spinning top in mud and failing as they have already done to diversify the economy outside of oil and gas. And I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Thompson-Ahye.
Mr. Vice President, I thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this debate on the Trinidad and Tobago Special Economic Zones Act 2021. Mr. Vice President, when you examine the long title of the proposed act or the bill which one looks at to determine its purpose or scope, it reads as follows: an act to provide for the designation, development, operation, and management of special economic zones, the establishment of the Special Economic Zones Authority, the repeal of the Free Zones Act, Chapter 8107, the regulation of special economic zones, and matters related thereto. An ordinary person like me, without background in such matters, will be none the wiser, unless provided with further explanation as to the true import of this bill and what it means to him or her. The government clearly does not subscribe to the KISS principle. As we know, that acronym stands for Keep It Simple, Stupid. This principle teaches that the easier something is to understand and use, the more likely it is to be embraced and employed. Simple doesn't necessarily mean short, you know. It looks to the provision of details on which one can base a considered opinion. So contrast our act with Bahamas Economic Empowerment Zones Act 2018, which has as its long title, an act to promote the redevelopment of communities of the Bahamas through the granting of certain exemptions and fiscal incentives for the renovation and restoration of property and the encouragement of business in a designated economic empowerment zone and for matters connected thereto. So on reading the long title of the Bahamas Act, one realizes immediately this law is about development and fiscal incentives for renovation and restoration of property and encouragement of business in a designated economic empowerment zone. I appreciate that. And if that were not enough, the Bahamas further provides a section titled Objectives, which makes the position even clearer. It states the objectives of this act are to designate communities as economic empowerment zones and to encourage the economic and social empowerment of residents in the zone, to provide for the granting of certain exemptions and fiscal incentives to persons engaging in economic activities in the designated zones, to promote the construction, renovation, and restoration of property and structures in a designated zone, and to encourage the principles of corporate social responsibility. Mr. Vice President, I dare say our proposed legislation is about all of that, save the last. And why not the last? Why not corporate responsibility? After all, we are providing a number of incentives, fiscal and otherwise, to encourage the development of business. We are foregoing taxes to build those businesses. Surely the persons benefiting from our largesse can give back to the community, to the people they might have displaced or inconvenienced or deprived in some way, because government has one pool, you know. So when they give one way, somebody in the other way is going to be deprived. And that way you will have to build the society. We must not be frightened and coward or be mendicants in our land, but must have the courage to make certain demands, not upon the flesh, you know, because we might lose out, because we might forget it comes with blood, but possibly we could require a kilogram of fat from the business entity that derives substantial benefits. Section 12 of this Bahamas Act, which carries the rubric duty of businesses to promote corporate social responsibility, states, every owner of a business shall include in its application a corporate responsibility statement outlining the business commitment to contributing to the sustainable development of the community through the provision of economic, social, and environmental benefits to the community at no cost to the community. You're getting something from me? Give back. Clause 4 of our Trinidad and Tobago bill creates a body corporate, the Trinidad and Tobago Special Economic Zones Authority. It's no accident, you know, that the word special is included in the name of the authority. I can think of no other corporate body created with such a special title. And this authority's functions are indeed very special. Clause 5 clothes the authority with an array of functions. It is at this juncture which one encounters of an extremely long interpretation section that one experiences an aha moment and begins to see the light about the purpose of this bill. I will not detail all the functions stated, but just some that I consider particularly instructive, namely clauses 5G to G, which state as follows. G, to facilitate an enabling environment in areas designated as special economic zones. H, to develop modern infrastructure required to attract foreign direct investment and stimulate domestic investment. And I did speak that the interpretation section was quite long, 4 pages, but it does not define modern infrastructure. So we leave that to our imagination. I, to promote economic development in local communities, and 5J, to advance further diversification of the economy. So at that point, I conclude that implementation of this bill for economic development was an important milestone in our journey towards diversification of the economy. I saw it as potentially being an important step in our quest to acquire foreign exchange by attracting foreign investment, and it could be a significant move to stimulate economic development by creating new industries and by facilitating job creation. Government cannot do it alone, so it was forging partnerships by creating an enabling environment for business creation. So we've been hearing all the time, you know, diversify, diversify. Oil and gas will no longer fly, so you're trying to diversify. Is Vision 2030 becoming clearer and nearer? I wondered. Or will this bill, if passed, signal a further downward slide in our economy? Will it produce rain in our fiscal drought or disaster for the disadvantaged? There are stories of similar enterprises elsewhere, that have not produced the desired result, but have had disastrous outcomes. The question to be examined is whether this bill, as designed, will fulfill its objectives. So the authority has been endowed with a wide range of responsibilities and powers, as detailed in Clause 5.2. These relate to finances, real property, and other assets of the authority, all aspects of its human resources, service standards and performance targets, code of conduct for employees, operating plan, budget, annual report, and other functions to carry out its mandate. So this special authority has quite a bit of work to do. Clause 6 details the powers now of the authority, which are significant and justify the authority and be described as a special authority. Among the authority's remit are the powers to issue guidelines and directions to operators, to cause to carry out investigations in relation to applicants I consider appropriate, to verify the accuracy of information in the application, and request further information and documents from the applicant, to grant and set the terms and conditions of licenses, to amend, to vary, to suspend or revoke licenses in accordance with provisions of the Act, to inspect licenses and zones in order to monitor and ensure compliance with this Act, and terms and conditions of licenses, etc., etc., etc. So there's a lot of work to be done. Now, I was very pleased to see that this bill makes provision for the applicant for an operator license to be informed in writing of the authority's intention to refuse to grant a license to an applicant, and also to give the applicant 14 days to submit written representations. So you get another bite of the cherry. Something is missing, you get a chance. It also provides that when an application is refused, the authority will give reason for the decision. Now, I must confess, after I read this Clause 7, I made a note to make this recommendation, that you mustn't just give reasons. You mustn't just give a refusal, you must give reason. So, after I spent some time dealing with that, when I reached Clause 38 now, I saw that it was in the Act, in the bill. So it means somebody has a wicked sense of humor, because they make me waste my time, looking for preparing something that was already there. Madam, Mr. Vice President, I trust that the verification and inspection exercises of this authority, unlike what we discovered with another statutory body in another place quite recently, will not take place virtually, but will be conducted in person Pandemic or no pandemic, go on site and see what is happening. Clause 7 speaks to the composition of the board. My comments regarding the board are, why does it stipulate engineering or accounting? Why not both professionals? I believe both the engineering and accounting professionals should be represented. I see no need, though, for 2 attorneys at law. 1 experienced attorney at law, to my mind, should be enough. I would wish to see included, though, someone experienced in matters of customs and excise. When I look at Section 8 of Jamaica's equivalent legislation, the Special Economic Zones Act 2016, and the composition of the board, which is detailed in the 3rd schedule of the Act, Part 2, I observe as includes in their board of directors of the authority the Commissioner of Customs and Excise or his nominee. Even if we do not have such a designation under our revenue law, I say we should include a person who has responsibility for functions relating to customs and excise. We will be granting exemptions in that area, and those things must be carefully monitored by someone with the required experience. Clause 10.3 is disturbingly deficient. It deals with disclosure of interest. It states that if such interest is likely to be affected by a decision of the board, the member must disclose to the board the nature of the interest and shall be recorded in the minutes. It further states that after the disclosure is made, the member shall A, not take part in any deliberation or decision of the board with respect to the relevant matter, and B, be disregarded for the purpose of constituting a quorum of the board. Clause 10.4 sets out the penalty for noncompliance. On summary conviction is $500,000, $500,000, imprisonment for 5 years. If convicted on indictment, that's at the High Court, a fine of $1 million and imprisonment for 10 years. That shows that we're serious. All right? Big fine. Clause 10 sets out a defense of lack of knowledge. But surely, those provisions require more than is set out here. What is meant by not taking part in the deliberations? That the member sits in the room and takes in the discussion? Surely not. That cannot be acceptable. What must happen is what is provided for in the Jamaican law and what is the practice here in matters of that nature. Namely, that the member with the conflict of interest, and I quote from the Jamaican law, shall excuse himself from the meeting while the matter is under discussion. So don't tell me that that's what you mean. We want it in the legislation for the removal of all doubt. Clause 18 is a welcome insertion in this proposed legislation. It proposes a pension plan for members of the authority and permanent employees. I hope it represents a shift in thinking of this government, as I'm not at all pleased about the fact that many government employees are now on contract of varying duration, ranging from 3 months to 3 years. I've complained about this before. And to add insult to injury, when such contracts expire, there are persons waiting for over a year to receive their gratuity. Some of them have reached out to me. Do so, do like so. While the grass is growing, the horse is starving. Have a heart. Pay persons promptly when they depart. Don't wait for people to riot. You know, some people like riots. Clause 19.2 is one for which I need clarification. Maybe it's just me. It states any sums of money, damages, or costs recovered against the authority for anything done or omitted or permitted to be done in good faith in the course of the operation of the authority shall be paid out of such amounts as may be appropriated by Parliament. Clause 21 lists the source of funds of the authority. This comprises A, monies appropriated by Parliament, B, monies derived from rentals, leases, concessions, or other activities carried on in zones, sums derived from loans raised by the authority in accordance with the approval of the minister, monies earned by or arising from investment made by the authority in connection with the operation of the zones, fees, dues, charges, or other monies collected for the grant of licenses to operate or SEZ enterprises and single zone enterprises, and monies as may lawfully be paid to the authority in respect of any matter incidental to its powers and duties under the Act. Mr. Vice President, the number of tributaries of the revenue stream flowing into the coffers of the authority seem fairly extensive, and if the funds are managed properly and designed creatively, can generate quite a bit of income. My question, therefore, is, does 19.2 refer to Clause 21A and means that Parliament will not foot any damages or costs incurred by the authority? If so, is not such a circumstance captured in 21.3E, which states among the items of expenditure for which sums of the authority may be spent is any other expenditure authorized by the board in this discharge of the authority's functions? At this juncture, I want to recommend the strongest terms that when you appoint a board of competent professionals, and there is a legal issue to be determined or defended in the court, the issue of who should represent the authority should not be a matter for Cabinet or the Attorney General, but the board. The considerations which guide the board's decision do not necessarily correlate with that of government. I'm not in a popularity contest. Mr. Vice President, Clause 30 of the bill gives the factors that are taken into account in the consideration of a geographical area to be designated a special economic zone. Including among the factors are Clause 30D, the existence of required off-site infrastructure, including roads, telecommunications, including water, power, sewage, telecommunications, solid waste, and water management. I would wish to know, in light of the fact that the general populace have been crying out for efficiency and availability of these basic services from time immemorial, what is government's plan to achieve this miraculous transformation? What is the secret of its intended success? And if there is such a plan for provision of these utilities and infrastructure for the special economic zones, what would be the likely impact on the citizenry and businesses outside these special economic zones? The last time I checked, our Constitution still guaranteed equality, and our anthem still assured that, whether grammatically correct or not, every creed and race, find an equal place. Mr. Vice President, this bill has 90 clauses and 4 schedules spanning 7 pages, and I have 30 minutes. So I must leave some points for my colleagues to address. But I would like to draw attention to a study by consultant Livius Chayukira, titled Special Economic Zones in Developing Countries, Challenges and Opportunities for Zimbabwe. And Madam, Ms. Dams, Hansa, don't stress yourself, I'll give you a copy of it, which was published in the Diverse Journal of Multidisciplinary Research, Volume 2, Issue 7, December 2020. Chayukira makes the point, literature has shown that inasmuch as there are enticements to operate under SEZs, the success of those depend on the external factors which comprise general infrastructure, that is, road and telecommunications, power and other support services, which facilitates easy movement of goods and services in and out of the zones. Studies have shown that investors interested in SEC are not keen to invest in these infrastructures, and becomes the responsibility of the host country. The question which needs an answer will be on how the government will recoup its money on infrastructure investments related to SEC when it offers these investors incentives not to pay taxes for a period of sometime more than 10 years in most instances. Clause 64.1 of the bill points to Schedule 1, which details the benefit to be enjoyed by the holder of an operator license, and Clause 64 to Schedule 2, which gives the benefit accruing to an SEC or a single zone enterprise. So Schedule 1 benefits include property tax, exemption from import duties for all approved capital goods, spare parts, raw materials, building materials, and other articles for development and management of the zone, stamp duty exemption on instruments for the purchase, lease, or other acquisition of land for use by an operator. Schedule 2 now benefits include benefits for different types of zones, free port, free trade zone, industrial park. Benefits include allowances, credit investment, relief, enhanced relief in accordance with the Income Tax Act, VAT zero rated for goods supplied to the zone and services provided by non-resident in zone, custom duty exemption on importation of all approved capital goods, spare parts, raw materials, stock in trade, and other articles for use in the zone, reduced corporation tax, etc., etc. Now, Chayukira makes the point that potential investors analyze the nature of the dominant culture, the legislation, the laws, and tax relief in a country before considering to invest. The assumption is that the more incentives offered, the higher the potential to attract investors. Now, in making that decision to invest, additional matters such as our position on the index of ease of doing business, which is currently 106, with 1 to 20 being the most favorable, and we had 106. That is also relevant. So you have also our place on the corruption index, which in 2020 was 86. And then you have these travel advisories that come that say Trinidad is a land of crime. I am now fighting an issue trying to get our international conference here, and they're telling me what they see, travel advisory. I'm saying Trinidad is not so bad, you know. Come. So they examine also the political landscape as the climate and culture of our politics are critical issues. They will ask themselves, is this a society that when there is a change of political regimes, the policies and plans of the previous administration will be abandoned for no good reason, save the reluctance to give credit to the adversary for a good idea? If the answer is in the affirmative, they will not be willing to invest in a new venture here. Chakira refers to this phenomenon as the need to separate government policies and party politics to ensure transparency and accountability to the citizens and ensure trust from investors so they will not be afraid of government change. So you have companies interested in SEC, and they are the same which moving around the moment they no longer benefit from fiscal incentive in the host country, and they move to an SEC in another country with favorable conditions. So how do we guard against people, in fact, what I call using the country like this, in this way? So you find the Jamaica Act assists us by Section 31, which says that a developer shall not assign, transfer, or otherwise dispose of its rights or obligation under a master concession or license agreement without the prior written consent of the authority. So you want to hold them to that. With respect to an assignment or the transfer of any obligation under a master concession by the developer shall, unless the authority otherwise agrees in writing, retain responsibility for its obligation under this act and the master concession as if no such assignment or transfer had occurred until the obligations have been performed to the satisfaction of the authority. So you know you can hold a little big stick over them at times. So you have also the Bahamas Act, which puts some restriction on what you do with the benefits. So restriction on disposition of materials imported duty-free. And it says, no materials or equipment imported into the Bahamas with the benefit of any exemption from customs duty under Section 708 shall be used for purposes other than the improvement, renovation, or restoration of property situated in the zone, or be sold, given away, or otherwise disposed of to a business outside of the zone, unless with the express approval of the Minister of Finance in writing. It goes on, no vehicle imported into the Bahamas with the benefit of any exemption under Section 8 shall be used for the purpose other than the business in the zone for which the exemption was granted, and shall be sold, given away, or otherwise disposed of within 5 years from the date of the importation, unless with the express approval of the Minister of Finance in writing. So you have to find some way to hold them to make sure that they do not benefit from the kindness that we have bestowed on them. So while it is an excellent initiative to have the free zones, to generate foreign exchange earnings, create employment, attract foreign capital and advance technology, acquiring labor management skill, and creating linkages between industries in economic zone and domestic economy, we must also remember our people, our society, and ensure that the SEZ should be built in line with the comparative advantage of the host country and should use local companies as part of their value chain activities. For example, in China, most SEZs are linked with local economy. So any policy which hinders domestic investors, I'm reading from the same author as before, from investing should be abolished, and we should advocate for policy which equate the domestic investor in SEZ to international one. Without domestic investors, the government will be left at the mercy of foreign investors, which is politically suicidal. And the geographical location of the zone should be done in areas which are close to both inland and border ports, and there are a number of conditions that we can put within the legislation and within our practice to assist our people. Because ultimately, this law is for building our economy, our society, And we must always remember who are supposed to be the ultimate beneficiaries of what we do. Too many times, people believe that we are a third world country and they can come in and make mass with us. All right? We know when to make our mass, and it is not with our economy. So there are things I believe that need fixing in the legislation.
Senator, you have 5 more minutes.
Yes, I'm going to give you 4, so thank you very much. And all I can do is recommend that we do our best to look at some of the things again. It's a start, it's a good start, but there are things that need to be done. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Ibrahim.
Mr. Vice President, colleagues, many thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this bill of national importance as it deals with the much needed diversification of our twin island economy. I begin in the name of God, the most gracious, and my country. Mr. Vice President, in my point of view, this bill seeks to move our twin island republic in one direction, and that is forward in greater prosperity. In a nutshell, if you mentioned to me that I had 2 more minutes to speak, and I had to surmise, I would say that the special economic zones will be critical for us to deepen our participation in global value and supply chains, not only by putting our people to work, but by stabilizing our economy through diversification, whilst offering the world what is best of us and allowing us in time to be a developed nation. Mr. Vice President, we've heard a few commentators and from the other side, independents and the opposition today. And what we have seen, what I have recognized is that a lot of people have taken a couple points and gone off on tangents rather than understanding the entire scope or taking a full scope of the bill. So allow me to go into it a little bit so that we can understand by taking a quick glimpse of our past and current situation. As we are aware, and the Minister, Honorable, who piloted the bill, the types of free zones enterprises that currently operate in Trinidad and Tobago, although non-energy related, do not best reflect the diversification thrust of the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Further to this, the current free zone regime, despite its very liberal incentives and non-restrictive locational requirements, has failed to attract any new dynamic and sustained investments over the last 6 years. Although there has been participation by the private sector, the free zone regime is largely traditional, with there being few restrictions to the types of firms operating as free zone enterprises and little integration of firms with the domestic economy. What we've heard here today is actually the same cry, but the bill in front of us moves this forward as to integrate the local economy and the spin-off effects of the businessman of Trinidad and Tobago. A World Bank study explicitly labels Trinidad and Tobago's operation as a traditional export processing zone model and goes on to describe the zones in Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean countries as having not kept pace with the Latin counterparts. According to a 2016 Doing Business report by the World Bank Group, Trinidad and Tobago had fallen 3 spots to 88 out of 189 economies. And Trinidad and Tobago regional performance, 11 out of 32 economies, was surpassed by several CARICOM and Latin American countries, including Mexico, Colombia, Jamaica, and St. Lucia. While there have been many reforms implemented to improve the ease with which business is conducted, things like bureaucracy and costly procedures continue to inhibit investment and businesses' activities in the country. The use of SEZs and other economic zones can and must be used as prototypes through which the government can develop and implement new measures to improve the ease of doing business in Trinidad and Tobago and to attract new investments. Mr. Vice President, the SEZs are a proven tool, and if implemented correctly, it can rapidly diversify a country's industrial base, it can attract foreign direct investment, increase job creation, and improve economic growth. And they come in many forms. Names and functions, for example, free trade zones, free zones, export processing zones, enterprise zones, etc., all reflect a government's priorities and positioning of its economy. However, what unifies them all is that they are all developmental tools by governments to attract and facilitate investments that act as catalysts to diversify a whole or targeted segments of their economies. The World Bank in September 2012 published a technical report following a request by the then government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to provide strategic guidance to improve the quality and effectiveness of investment, promotion, and special economic zones in Trinidad and Tobago. The authors of that report pointed to the fact that SEZs could offer foreign investors outside of oil and gas opportunities for regulatory simplicity, investment security, infrastructure, and hassle-free access to inputs, as well as the ability to stimulate widespread diversification and growth through linkages with the domestic economy and complete value chains complete value chains to firms within the zones. The report further stated that Trinidad and Tobago's economic zones have played an insignificant role in the growing and diversification of the economy and highlighted the following shortcomings in the present free zone regime. This has been expounded earlier on, and I don't wish to go into it any further, but I'll just like to call the main 5 headlines of what was identified: a weak legal and regulatory framework, an ineffective policy framework, poor performance by existing zones, and therefore a new policy is required to guide and modernize the development of special economic zones in Trinidad and Tobago and ensure that this complements the overall development and diversification thrust by the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Vice President, this bill seeks to address this and to provide a new, more dynamic SEZ regime. We heard earlier that it was said that this SEZ is just basically a name change, but that is really far from the truth. I believe it was Senator John who mentioned that it was the same, just labeled differently. But the name change from free zone to SEZ is not a simple matter of form over substance. The SEZ concept is a deliberate policy breakaway from past policy, and it is intended to send a clear signal to the investor, community, both domestic and international, the multilateral lending agencies, the World Trade Organization, that Trinidad and Tobago is moving forward in a new policy direction. Mr. Vice President, the benefits are glaring when we look at the characteristics of the traditional versus the modern free zone. Let's take the characteristics of the physical characteristics and compare it to traditional versus the modern, where we are looking to move ourselves into. The physical location of a traditional zone will be isolated ring-fence enclaves restricted of relatively remote areas or near transport hubs. Modern, which is the SEZ model, is physical infrastructure is larger in size. It can have countrywide zone development, customized infrastructure that meets the needs of firms, and allow greater flexibility in terms of plant location, incentives, and privileges. The traditional model emphasizes on financial and fiscal incentives and privileges to firms. In the modern SEZ regime and structure, It is the inclusion of non-financial and non-fiscal incentives that differentiate the country or zone. Enterprises can freely import any merchandise in any quantity and are not restricted to direct imports for manufacturing, as in the case of the current EPZs. Duty and tax-free merchandise can be sold at the retail or wholesale level and sometimes consumed within the same area. There's no restriction on that. Market access. In the traditional aspect, the export requirements for manufactured goods are usually 70 to 80%. In the modern structure, it allows unrestricted sale to the local markets or to the consumers as long as all applicable import duties, taxes, and other charges are fully paid. This is a marked difference in opening the economy to the businessmen of this country and forging networks between our current structure and the new structure. Firm requirements. 80 to 100% of exported-oriented foreign ownership under the traditional model. Under the new model, strategic sectors, minimum investment threshold, technology transfer, and environmental standard sensitivity. It's a broader range of permissible activities, commercial and professional services, all types of manufacturing and processes. Policy direction. The traditional one, often viewed as growth poles for national and regional development, emphasizes on export, promotion, job creation, and technology transfer. Within the new mechanism, within the new structure, there's a mechanism to promote two-way trade and facilitate liberalization and modernization of host economy. Firms are integrated into the domestic economy, and that is truly a benefit. In the administration, it is mainly government-owned and developed and operated in the traditional sense. But in the modern structure and in the new structure in the SEZ, it's autonomous. It can be partially autonomous bodies, participation of both public and private sector in the development and management. And I remember earlier on today, Senator Timal was asking a question about the standards of work for labor. And in its international norms and standards, in the classic and the traditional format, the restrictions to unionization of labor. However, in the new structure, financial incentives and labor standards that are compatible with World Trade Organization and International Labor Organization, respectively. Mr. Vice President, one of the biggest differences is here that there is a shift towards the private sector. Greater involvement of the private sector in the development of zones reduces the burden placed on public resources and increases the efficiency of zones by allowing them to operate under market mechanisms. Connecting Trinidad and Tobago to the world. These SEZs will facilitate Trinidad and Tobago, the interconnectivity to the rest of the world, allowing for the freer movement of goods, services, people, capital, and data. The point of view for the local businesses are as follows. The SEZs should be viewed as export platforms for local businesses that facilitate the reduction of the associated logistics, transport, and administrative costs of trading across borders. The SEZ, while physically located in Trinidad, are an international space that are a captive export market for local producers to engage global value change without having to leave the geographic borders of Trinidad and Tobago. This in itself is a big gain for all local businessmen. Mr. Vice President, the objectives of this bill, of the Special Economic Zone legislation for Trinidad and Tobago, is to basically modernize and strengthen the existing regulatory framework governing free zones, taking into account the progression of free zones worldwide, international best practices, and the unique national circumstances and developmental agenda of the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. The specific objectives of the Trinidad and Tobago SEZ policy are to develop a new modern specific economic zone regime, to expand the country's revenue base, to increase and diversify the exports and investments in the economic areas, in economic zones, to increase and enhance private sector participation in the economy through SEZ development and operation, to integrate the Special Economic Zone enterprise with national development objectives to facilitate economic development across all regions of the country and to increase the compliance of SEZ operations with local, regional, and international standards of law. Mr. Vice President, the SEZ should be viewed as a special vehicle for our nation and citizenry. This increased participation or value addition may come in a variety of forms that would see Trinidad and Tobago and our people expanding their skills and their expertise in research and development, design, production, logistics, marketing or services, etc., in a range of industries. For Trinidad and Tobago, much like the Chinese model, the models across Europe, Jamaica, South Africa, Latvia, to name a few special economic zones, it is viewed as a special vehicle to increase its participation in the global economy. We heard about demand and supply earlier on, and we spoke about the validity of actually having this happen now. We're hearing about a world in a COVID sense, in light of COVID and in a pandemic. But let's just look at two instances and why it is we would want to pull investors and why would investors want to come to this side of the world even though they have so many SEZs across the globe. And two particular instances come to mind. With the demand and the production of goods and services coming in from the East to the Americans, having to reach post first and second wave of the pandemic into the Americans, what we have heard over the last 3 to 5 weeks is that the ports on the western side of the Americans are inundated, blocked, long lines, processing issues, which would result in higher costs and longer delivery times for goods and services to the Americans. Let's just say another example is as follows. I remember not so long ago, we had a situation where we had the clogging of the Panama Canal. This was by a vessel that had run ashore, and no one could have passed, and lines were created, and it set back production and delivery of goods and services to this side of the globe for a long period of time. These are reasons why in a changing world, companies from across the globe, from the East, would look to set up shop, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, in the Americans, for the sole purpose of distributions. And what we see here is an opportunity. But Mr. Vice President, the real impact is on the wider economy. The real value of economic zones depends on their ability to stimulate widespread growth through linkages with the domestic economy and to catalyze nationwide reforms by serving as pilots. Mr. Vice President, by looking at the types of special economic zones and permitted economic activities, the true scope of this motion comes to light. A developmental zone. Activities here focus on the development of a specific geographic region with emphasis on such factors as employment, skills training, entrepreneurship and rural development, and overall social and economic development of the area. I think that goes to one of the hearts of the last presenter, to what she mentioned about the locals and the Trinidadians and the citizenry being not left out. Another categorization is the free port, a duty-free area located at a port of entry where imported goods may be unloaded for warehousing, repackaging, or processing of imported goods or value-adding activities and logistics services. There's also a free trade zone, a duty-free area that accommodates specific activities targeted for international trade. There's also an industrial park, a purpose-built industrial estate that leverages domestic and foreign fixed direct investment in value-added manufacturing industries. Single-zone enterprise, restricted to one business entity engaged in any one of the following business activities: manufacturing, maritime services, aviation services, fishing and fish processing, agriculture and agro-processing, information and communication technology, creative industries, financial services, medical tourism, and renewable energy. Thus, one of the great development effects of SEZs are the spillover effects into the rest of the economy. And that is one of the pivotal differences of moving into a direction like this, the spillover effects to the nation, the widening of our economy, the availability of goods and services to the nationals through the businessmen, the same businessmen who own warehousing that Mr. Senator Lyder was speaking about. It is an advantageous point to take note of when it is we are structuring in this critical format. But for Mr. Vice President, for meaningful impact is critical. For those impacts to be meaningful, its sustainable forward and backward linkages have to be forged by deliberate policy direction and actions, and this bill recognizes this fact as it creates several mechanisms to achieve this. The laws that the zones operate under, just like the physical infrastructure, have to be adequate and appropriate, fit for purpose. This is much more than just cutting red tape, but it's about reducing bureaucracies, being facilitators and delivering government services as value additions. I remember Senator Timal was asking a question about who would be responsible for the infrastructure and where does the infrastructure come from. And no, it's not the operator and the operator license, but it is from the local government. Investors, to the best of my knowledge, investors must have confidence that it is easy to invest, their investment is safe, and that the operations of the investment will not be compromised by excessive red tape. Using government services as incentives. As such, Trinidad and Tobago SEZs will be focused on fiscal incentives, but more on providing a platform to meet the efficiencies demanded by the global marketplace. Central to this are the soft initiatives inherent in regulatory relief, such as expedited investment, construction, work permit approvals, and streamlined and efficient customs inspections. The move to place greater resilience on businesses and trade facilitation reflects not only international best practices, but also reflect a growing global trend of governments using their regulatory functions as services to investors, and in effect, non-fiscal incentives. Effective administration. The Special Economic Zone Authority. The efficient and effective administration of the SEZ regulatory environment is a self-evident, yet often understated success factor for the SEZs. This goes beyond attracting and facilitating investment, as important as that is, into due diligence, long-term assessment, planning, and ongoing monitoring of investors and the investments to ensure that they align to the country's goals and policy priorities. We had a question asked about a 5-year lease for a small industry and also annual inspections of accounts of companies. If a company is taking up a license and is not performing and is not giving the correct inputs to the country, and we are not benefiting from it, from the scrutiny of the annual financial information from these companies, that is enough reason to actually pause or remove or replace the individuals so that everyone who comes inside is of added value to the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago. In the Special Economic Zone Authority, this legislation, just much like China, has created mechanisms to do just that. Mr. Vice President, this is clearly evident in all aspects of this bill, as no stone was left unturned in its approach as it's made its way to the House. But, Mr. Vice President, what must be noted is the physical matters as well, on and off-site infrastructure. One of the most critical factors that contribute to the success or failure of zones is availability and integration of adequate and appropriate infrastructure inside and outside of a zone. This infrastructure, land, sea, air, or technology, must not only be fit for purpose, but must be networked together to create value for stakeholders, workers, governments, investors, etc. Special economic zones are therefore the primary economic drivers and job creation within the Ministry of Trade. Mr. Vice President, some say build and it will come. But what we are saying is that ships and planes need a reason to stop in Trinidad and Tobago. It is not simply a case of build and they will come. You don't just build a highway to the end of the country. It must be going there with a plan for the purpose of feeding industry, for the purpose of utilizing the infrastructure. And this will give us a catalyst once we know and we have designated areas, in my belief, in my opinion, to actually have a purpose for this level of development. Our ports and airports will also serve as facilitation mechanisms for cargo and people flows coming in and out of the SEZs. Mr. Vice President, in conclusion, to summarize and close, why are SEZs so important to us? If Trinidad and Tobago is to develop, diversify, grow its economy, and provide prosperity for its people,
Senator, you have 5 more minutes.
It needs to enhance its existing offerings, but more importantly, it needs to move beyond them and provide a suite of SEZ clusters through which cargo, people, and data can flow seamlessly. Mr. Vice President, I thank you.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for recognizing me and allowing me to make what I hope will be a short intervention in this debate today. Somebody chuckled there. It will be short. But before I actually substantially start my contribution, I think my colleagues will, and yourself, good self, will allow me to take a couple of seconds to bid congratulations to Her Excellency President Dame Sandra Mason, the first President of Barbados, Prime Minister Mia Mottley for guiding Barbados to Republican status, and of course also Ambassador Rihanna Robin Fenty, who was made a National Hero of Barbados during the celebration. So congratulations to our Caribbean counterparts. I listened to Senator Ibrahim, and I'll take a line from my colleague, Minister of Agriculture, Clarence Rambarat, when he started his contribution last time we were here. And this is not meant to diminish the importance of this bill by any means, but Minister Rambarat's line when he started came to me pretty speeches. Maybe this is not the time for it. So I got a chance to volley back one to Minister Rambarat. Very pretty speeches today. But how practical and how much will we be able to make good on what is clearly, and let me say it from the start, extremely diligent work by our colleague, Minister of Trade, Minister Gopi Schoon. Certainly a compendium of best practice in theory and policy, because if you do any cursory search in special free zones, you would see that the bill contains a lot of what would have been experienced in the last couple decades in many jurisdictions around the world. So the bill is not absent of research and due diligence. And a lot of reference has been made to China, Dubai, Japan, and other jurisdictions. But there are stark differences between China, Dubai, and many of these jurisdictions. Politically, in terms of governance systems, in terms of culture, in terms of sociology, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of responsiveness, And in terms of competitiveness, the Honourable Minister of Trade, when she piloted the bill earlier on today, indicated there were over 4,000 free zones in over 100 countries around the world, which means free zones is a highly competitive endeavor, highly competitive globally, and many of these countries have a track record much superior to ours. We have a 33-year history in it, and in the minister's own words, not particularly successful and not much to show for it, which clearly precipitates the proposals before us today. And there are many advantages to these economic zones in any particular jurisdiction. Clearly, it's interesting that what comes to mind is something that the Honorable Attorney General often regales us with, which is plant, machinery, process, and people. I want to add three more P's to that. Post-mortem, pivot. I also want to add repositioning and responsiveness in a competitive environment. And what is our track record where those are concerned? Clearly, there was some analysis done of what has happened in Trinidad and Tobago. I know the minister only had 40 or 45 minutes to present or pilot the bill, but certainly I would have liked to hear, in a bill that contains 90 clauses and 5 schedules, a little time spent on an analysis, a greater analysis of why we have failed and only have 15 entities to show after 33 years, because it would have laid the foundation for the transition to this new proposal. What we are faced with in Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Vice President, through you, is ineffective performance, a significant institutional gaps and implementation gaps, and poor performance in existing zones. And if we are not careful to absorb and apply remedies to the lessons that we've learned from our 33 years in the past, it's just going to be another layer of bureaucracy and frustration. In terms of the zones, and my colleagues would have identified several of the attractive points in forming these zones in Trinidad and Tobago, and the bill goes into quite a lot of detail in terms of the different types of zones envisioned by the government. Includes, of course, what has been spoken about by many colleagues before, the attraction of rare and important critical foreign direct investment. Ghana, for example, their SEZs represented between 2000 and 2008 48% of their total national FDIs between that time frame, which accounted to billions of dollars in revenues for the country. But again, we are comparing ourselves and moving into an era of competitiveness with many of these jurisdictions that, one, have a head start, and two, have much more impressive track records of implementation and monitoring and pivoting and responsiveness. So it's one thing to plan. We're very good at that in Trinidad and Tobago. It's a completely different thing to implement, monitor, and pivot and respond to a changing environment. Because while we have the greatest intention of moving into being more competitive, they are not standing still. They also continue to be responsive and moving, and they have much more resources at their disposal. Also, the establishment of growth poles is one of the advantages, and Senator Ibrahim and others would have indicated that, it is one of the intentions of the government to use these to initiate growth poles, and in theory it works. And yes, it has worked in Africa, encouraging private sector participation. But if you have not dealt with the issues related to productivity in the country as a whole, because we're not going to become a more productive country by osmosis just because we seek to pass this bill or we pass this bill. All the issues that would have contributed to our failures in the past still exist. Senator Ibrahim, our colleague just before, who spoke about, and I took note about it, and I said, that's interesting. He spoke about Trinidad and Tobago being a gateway to America. He spoke about ports being, when he spoke about the Panama Canal and the opportunities that would have existed with the supply chain blockages in the U.S. He also spoke about streamlining customs and efficiency. And for a minute, I got confused. I was wondering if he was talking about Trinidad and Tobago, because this has not been our history. And a bill is not going to fix all of that. It's not. We have to build this, if it is to be successful, upon a foundation where all those systems have been rectified to facilitate the growth that is being projected and proposed in this bill. And I haven't heard about, and I know the minister, to be fair to her, the honourable minister, only had 45 minutes to present a voluminous bill. But I'm hoping in her wrapping up that she can deal, or her colleagues can deal with some of those issues, because those issues still confront us. It's even more complex now in a pandemic and in a post-pandemic environment. So I'm hoping that we can address the elephant in the room, because it seems that this bill is being proposed as some sort of silver bullet, and I hate the reference because of our environment now, in an era where the guns seem to be malfunctioning and misfiring. So I hope those things can be addressed. And there's also the issue when you look at the research on special economic zones, particularly in developing countries, is that while they are proposed and they have been successful in attracting foreign direct investment, as I indicated before, in several jurisdictions, that is predicated on the fact that there is a sense of, one, improved security, both economically, physically, and otherwise, and in the present context, in a cyber context, because many of these special economic zones are digitally integrated to facilitate efficiency and accountability and transparency. There's supposed to be an improved access to lands, protection of land rights, economic and conservation systems in place, because in many of the jurisdictions that have not had the robust legislative framework to deal with conservation issues, there have been negative consequences to unregulated development into free zones without that sort of Ministry of Planning, Conservation, and Ecological Protection system. And also investor-friendly regulations, linkages and facilitation by the ministries to the private sector. And of course, one of the ones we have in abundance is reliable electricity supply. So we have some competitive advantages. There's also the need to be the focus on developing that closer working relationship with the private sector. And in those cases where it has worked, the private sector has been the driver and the government the facilitator. And I have to say that the bill seems to be, in a policy direction, facilitating that. One of the issues that also needs to be taken into consideration, and I have not seen a lot of emphasis placed on it in the bill, is the equalization of the playing field, because one of the negative consequences that came about in some of the other jurisdictions was while special economic zones are touted to promote entrepreneurial spirit and develop SMEs in a more robust way, if the legislation does not contain special provisions for equalizing the playing field for SMEs who have less resources and less capacity, what happens is big business flourishes, they take over these special economic zones, and it doesn't achieve the objective of ensuring that SMEs, and particularly the upcoming SMEs, are facilitated. So there's a wider SME cadre in the country at the end of a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year projection, which stabilizes the economies in an even stronger sense. And I know the minister may be able to speak to that in terms of how the legislation is aimed at ensuring that the playing field is equalized, particularly for the newcomers and the SMEs that don't have the kind of capacity that the more long-standing, bigger companies would have had. And I say bigger in the context of SMEs. One of the issues also, when one does the research in terms of the success factors in special economic zones, is the state having a clear and consistent policy that can be applied past the changes in administration. And our colleague, Senator Thompson-Ahye, spoke about that, because that kind of continuity is very important for international investors. And Trinidad and Tobago has had, in the last 20 years or so, cycles of changing administrations where we had continuity in the last election, but that had not been the case before. And big international investors, the larger international investors, in a competitive environment, want to be sure that when they decide on a particular jurisdiction for investment and for setting up their business practices, that if an administration changes, they don't suffer because of it, and their investment is not in jeopardy. And they can be assured of a continuation of what was promised to them contractually. So also one of the issues in the other jurisdictions that I researched is the issue of, during the course of the implementation stage and the monitoring stage, there are not changes in decision based on what is politically expedient, which is what has happened in some of the African countries who have gone in this direction. And the importance of the state to ensure that the facilities and the investment continues to continue a particular growth pattern. Because as I said before, while we may be now moving to pivot in this direction to become more effective in this sector, the others who are ahead of us are also evolving. And they also have more experience and in many cases more capacity than we do. So we need to be very careful about that in terms of how we implement this moving forward. Mr. Vice President, among the issues we also need to guard against, and I think this is one of the most important, is the issue of whether or not we are going to be competitive and to attract this critical foreign direct investment is, and it's happened in other jurisdictions, so I'm sounding the alarm bells early on, is in a bid to attract the foreign direct investment and the global partners in this, is offer unsustainable tax breaks and unsustainable subsidies in a bid to attract that, and we've suffered those kinds of maladies before. And I know it's a delicate balancing act when you want to move into an area that's very competitive. But I think it's very important to consider that moving forward, because then what happens is your net gain is reversed in the long run in your bid, in your attempt to try and be competitive when your competitive advantages in terms of leverage is less than the bigger players. Also, we need to be very careful that the regulation and monitoring of these special economic zones is extremely vigilant, because what has happened in other jurisdictions is a lack or relaxed vigilance and softened custom controls, lack of transparency and accountability mechanism. Many of these economic zones become dumping grounds for contraband, for fake products, for illegal transshipment of contraband goods and services because of a lax regulatory framework and a lax monitoring framework. And I had the opportunity through the Joint Select Committee of National Security to tour customs and excise and the port facilities. And it's a loose analogy because a port is not necessarily the same as the infrastructure that goes into a special economic zone. But certainly there are several commonalities in terms of monitoring, law enforcement, and overall oversight. And it was almost in some instances you had to laugh when you looked at the supervisory systems. And one of the big points that has come out in terms of the vulnerabilities of the special economic zones around the world, particularly those that are not as vigilant where monitoring is concerned, is the issue of these zones being turned into contraband transshipment centers. In some instances, illegal guns, in some instances, drugs, because the controls have become so lax, so they become fulcrum for international criminal activity. So I think we need to be very, very careful where that is concerned, particularly because of Trinidad and Tobago's position advantageous position at that, as a gateway to South America, the Caribbean, and North America, if we are not as vigilant as we should, because the research points to the fact that the special economic zones, and I quote, can be easily used as mechanisms to move illegal products around the world, in some instances going so far as being assembly points, manufacturing and processing points, and warehousing and repackaging and relabeling points for many of the contraband goods and the fake and the knockoff items that we see going around the world from the big manufacturers. We need to be very careful of that. And a lack of controls has made many of the free zone areas attractive locations for parties engaging in illicit trades, according to the Financial Action Task Force report 2010. We also need to be very mindful and careful about ensuring that labor practices in these free zones are in line with our labor laws in Trinidad and Tobago to protect the rights, because very often migrant workers are lured into these situations and exploited. It's another big point of concern around the world, and we need to be careful because of our migrant situation and the vulnerability of the migrants who, in many cases, have come from desperate circumstances, end up taking up these jobs in the free, special free trade zones, and are being exploited in a very horrendous manner, Mr. Vice President. And also, because I did say I wasn't going to be long, so I want to prove someone wrong today. In terms of us really maximizing the potential of this, is, and I'm going to go back to this, is really encapsulated in 10 simple points. One, Trinidad and Tobago's implementation gaps. I spoke about that before. We've all referenced it in many of our contributions. We are great at planning. We are great at projecting. We are horrendous at implementation and consistency. In an ever-changing environment, that is critical for success. Two, consistency of policy and policy responsiveness to a changing global environment. Three, the productivity issues in Trinidad and Tobago, because no matter what we put in place, efficiency and productivity are very important in being competitive. Four, ensuring that environmental issues are taken care of, because in some of these free zone areas, the types of shortcomings in ensuring that environmental safety issues are adhered to have become a great issue in many of the particularly African countries. Of course, many of my colleagues before spoke about the ease of doing business in Trinidad and Tobago, and well, that's an ongoing battle. We're at 106 and falling. The effective and efficient and transparent and accountable customs and excise issues, that's number 6, accountability and transparency. 8, security, in terms of physical security and digital security in the evolving world, because I don't think it's being given the kind of attention in Trinidad and Tobago, not only in terms of trade and these special economic zones, but certainly across the country. And we don't want to wait for the big hack to come, where most of our systems are now online, to suffer the fate and be coming from behind. 9, the over-reliance on subsidies and tax exemptions to attract foreign direct investment. 10, focusing on ensuring that fakes and illegal copyright issues and intellectual property issues are dealt with in these zones. And of course, 10, and finally, the issue of laundering, money laundering, or the use of these zones for money laundering purposes, and also exploitation of vulnerable groups in society. So while in principle, Mr. Vice President, the Honorable Minister has presented what seems to be a very productive proposal, the gap between planning, execution, and consistency of efficient performance are wide in Trinidad and Tobago. The chasm is so wide that I fear that this may end up again like a great plan, and in 15 years somebody has to form a committee or a commission of inquiry to investigate why the free trade zone spent over $15 billion, and we have nothing to show for it. Let's learn from our mistakes, and if we are to do it, adopt some of the recommendations or the amendments that some of my colleagues would have identified earlier, and ensure that we actually get it right in the interest of the people of Trinidad, Tobago, and our partners. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Leader of Government Business.
Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I beg to move that this House do now adjourn to Tuesday, 7th December 2021 at 10 a.m. And on that day, we'll continue. We take the debate on this bill through the remaining stages, the Special Economic Zones Bill. Thank you.
Honourable Senators, before I put the question on the adjournment, leave has been granted for two matters to be raised on the motion for the adjournment of the Senate. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the first matter I would like to address is the need for the government to explain the arrangements with respect to the continuing acting employment of the Chief Executive Officer of Heritage Petroleum. Mr. Vice President, today, November 30th, 2021, marks the third anniversary of the infamous, shameful, and unpatriotic decision by this government to shut down Petrotrin and send home thousands of workers, and in so doing, decimate the economy of southern Trinidad and ruin thousands of families. 3 years now, Mr. Vice President, the refinery has not operated, and it is becoming evident to the people of this country that the refinery is now dead, and our days as a center for refining have come to an end. There have been 2 failed attempts to divest the refinery, but to date, all we have is games being played with patriotic energies. Mr. Vice President, one of the companies that is a predecessor to Petrotrin is Heritage, which we hear boasts about. We are told it is making a profit, but that is a sham argument. The upstream aspect of Petrotrin, also known as its exploration and production arm, was always profitable. So to beat your chest and say Heritage is profitable is at best a moot point, and at worst, naked P&M propaganda. Heritage inherited a producing oil company named Petrotrin that was built with the sweat and the intellect of workers who were contemptuously dismissed. Some 3 years ago, Mr. Vice President, Heritage hired one Mike Wiley, an American, to be its CEO. He left shortly after it was reported that he had health issues. On September 2nd, 2019, it was reported that one Arlene Chow was appointed as interim Chief Executive Officer of Heritage Petroleum. What was the process used then to arrive at Mrs. Chow? Was that position advertised? And were different people interviewed? We were also told, Mr. Vice President, that this was a short-term measure until Heritage could find a CEO. Mr. Vice President, it is now more than 2 years later, and Ms. Chow, CEO, is still at the helm of Heritage. In June of 2020, the late Franklin Kahn, and may his soul rest in peace, revealed that this interim CEO was earning a salary of $150,000 per month. Did the Chief Personnel Officer review and comment on that salary? Is Heritage Petroleum the personal property of the PNM? This is a state enterprise, and it must act in accordance with the principles of good corporate governance. Is this how BPTT or Atlantic, where Ms. Chow previously worked, operated? Would this be tolerated at BPTT or Atlantic LNG? Ms. Chow, in her interim CEO role, is responsible for leading a management team, and in accordance with Appendix B of page 52, Section 2.3 of the State Enterprise Monitoring Manual, it would be part of the Tenders Committee. Mr. Vice President, are we saying that an interim CEO who was virtually handpicked by the present government presides over the procurement of billions in assets and the sale of crude oil worth billions of dollars? Mr. Vice President, that is a situation that is untenable. And it really is akin to a banana republic. What does the local chapter of Transparency International have to say about this? What does the mass media have to say about this, Mr. Vice President? Can you imagine if this untenable situation were happening under a United National Congress government? The PNM would be up in arms. The situation at Heritage is symptomatic of the PNM's contempt for good governance and process. Mr. Vice President, the PNM government needs to immediately cause the board of Heritage Petroleum,
Senator, you have 2 more minutes,
to advertise this vacancy and to invite an independent HR firm to oversee the process, because the process may be subject to political contamination, as was the process for the hiring of a commissioner of police. The government needs to start and conclude this process with urgency, because having a hand-picked favorite as interim CEO of a major state enterprise, Mr. Vice President, is both untenable and embarrassing. Mr. Vice President, I lay my case and I look forward to a proper response from the government.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, thankfully, I come from the east coast of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm accustomed with blue crab, and this has been reminiscent of eating crab. Senator Mark has presented me with a large amount of shell that I must work through to get to the little piece of meat in this matter. In fact, he's not even come close to his own motion, which simply calls upon the government to explain arrangements for the continuing employment of the acting CEO. Everything else has been shell. The Chief Executive Officer of Heritage Petroleum Company Limited was employed under a contract of service which commenced on 1st September 2019. It is well known that the CEO who had been recruited before that had to leave the country to deal with a personal matter. By letter dated 26 February 2020, the contract of the acting CEO was extended by the Board of Directors of Heritage to 31st December 2020. And by letter dated 28 December 2020, there was a further extension to 31st December 2021. So this acting arrangement commenced on the 1st September 2019 in circumstances which are well known to my colleague. It was extended by letter of 26 February 2020 to December 31st, 2020, and thereafter it was extended to 31st December 2021, which is a month away. May I say, Mr. Vice President, that under the direction and leadership of the acting CEO, Heritage has been stabilized and has been profitable. My friend takes that as a given, but if the situation had been the opposite, we would have heard a lot of crab shell today from him. It's not automatic that Heritage has been profitable. It has to do with the arrangements that have been made by the government for the operation of Heritage, including having an experienced person to act as CEO, given the circumstances of the departure of the person who was recruited. Heritage has been meeting its production and financial targets for financial year 2020 and 2021, despite the low-price environment for crude oil and challenges to the industry due to COVID-2019 and other factors which existed in 2020 and the initial months of 2021. The acting CEO has overseen and guided the strengthening of Heritage coming out of the restructuring of Petrotrin. Mr. Vice President, as I close, the Board of Directors intends to extend the CEO's contract of service for a further interim period, during which time the process for selection and recruitment of a successor will be conducted. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the second matter I would like to address is the growing global food shortage and its potential negative impact on the people of our country. Mr. Vice President, there is no doubt that the global supply chain has been disrupted because of COVID-19 pandemic, among other factors which I shall share with you. This global supply chain disruption would have led to increases in the cost of food supplies and has generated severe and grave shortages in several parts of the global community. This, of course, Mr. Vice President, has led to astronomically high increases in the prices of basic commodities, foodstuff in this particular instance, and its impact have been extremely hard and harsh on ordinary, vulnerable, and marginalized populations. Trinidad and Tobago is no exception. Mr. Vice President, rising food prices can be attributed to a number of factors, in addition to what I mentioned earlier. We have to look at climate change. In some countries, Mr. Vice President, production of bumper crops literally no longer exists. And therefore, you have a crisis in both the supply side and, of course, the demand side. In many countries, Mr. Vice President, there have been food shortages. Trinidad and Tobago, because of that experience, we have had high prices resulting in that particular phenomenon. Mr. Vice President, many countries are not exporting foodstuff in the quantum that they used to in the past. And therefore, this government, that is the PNM government, has a duty and responsibility to encourage and promote agricultural development, agricultural production expansion, and consequently food security for our society. But Mr. Vice President, when we compound the challenges in foreign exchange shortages, we have our importers having difficulty in accessing foreign exchange. And therefore, black market prices is a phenomenon that exists in our economy. It means to say, Mr. Vice President, that people are being called upon to pay higher prices for goods and services. A basket of goods in the supermarket, in the grocery, Mr. Vice President, has increased phenomenally for the ordinary people by hundreds of dollars on a weekly basis. People have to pay for food, and the middle classes have to pay thousands more for the same amount of food that they bought, let's say, before the pandemic. It has been a crisis in that regard. Mr. Vice President, when you compound this with what has been described as the phenomenal increases in freight rates, for example, last year, a 40-foot container coming from China cost the importer in Trinidad and Tobago some $5,000. Mr. Vice President, that has now been increased to $15,000 for the said 40-foot container. At the same time, the government, this heartless, senseless government, has increased customs duties on certain imported goods for their friends and financiers. So pasta products has been increased from 20% to 60%. And Mr. Vice President, as you know, more duties mean higher prices for the customer or the consumer. Then we have the level of incompetence brought about by delays in the clearance of goods at the port. That is further compounded, Mr. Vice President, by staff shortages at the Customs and Excise Department. Then there's the regular occurrence of the breaking down of equipment on the ports, whether it's Point Lisas or the port of Port of Spain. And this, Mr. Vice President, has resulted in delays, causing importers to pay rent and demurrage charges. Mr. Vice President, the long and short of it is that we are in a very difficult situation as a nation. And it behoves the government to really embark and channel more resources, encourage and inspire more citizens, redeploy CPEP labor, URP labor, marry that with private farmers to get involved in agricultural production, agricultural expansion, so that we can have some degree of food security as this pandemic continues unabated. We don't know, Mr. Vice President, when it will come to an end. What we do know is that there has been major supply chain disruptions, and that has resulted in a phenomena of food shortages, food supply in many countries of the globe today. And as I said, combine that with our inability to provide our importers with adequate foreign exchange, and they have to go onto the black market. It means whether you shop at Price Mart or you shop at Food Basket or the one that they have in the Grand Bazaar, the prices are going up every week. And every woman, every female
Senator, you have 2 more minutes.
household, thank you, Mr. Vice President, can testify to the fact that every week they go to the grocery, Mr. Vice President, the prices of goods are going up every week, and it is really making havoc for the family. And Mr. Vice President, so dangerous has the situation emerged that persons who are unemployed and who have not had an increase since 2013, you have had parents, women skipping meals, children skipping meals, children not being given 3 square meals a day. And Mr. Vice President, I call on the government to really put forward a proper and adequate plan to step up and ramp up agricultural production, food expansion, so that we can have a downsize in the cost of buying goods on the market and bring about some level of food security if and when this crisis worsens in the future. Mr. Vice President, I lay my case.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. And Mr. Vice President, the motion involves a number of ministers and ministries, and I thank my colleagues, Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister of Works, Minister of Finance, Minister of Social Development and Family Services, and other ministers for their input in this important motion. And the motion, Mr. Vice President, points to the potential negative impact of what is happening globally. And the first point I want to make, Mr. Vice President, is a reminder that Trinidad and Tobago feeds itself with a combination of imported staples and other food and locally grown or produced food. So we import our staples and other food, and we also grow and produce food locally. Mr. Vice President, we are price takers when it comes to imported staples and imported food. In the case of staples, wheat and oil and some of those things, rice, the prices are determined in relation to global food exchanges, and a lot of the prices are determined based on future sales. So globally, Mr. Vice President, as my colleague correctly pointed out, prices rose by the end of September 2021. Prices globally, food prices had risen 30% compared to the previous year. But I'll say this, Mr. Vice President, that while we have seen increases in the supermarket, it may not be to the extent of 30% on every item. It varies according to the item. And these increases, as Senator Mark correctly pointed out, is based on a number of factors. Of course, COVID has been a factor. COVID-19 has been a direct factor in relation to shutdowns around the world, particularly affecting internal transport arrangements in Europe, Asia, North America, affecting labor supply and availability of labor, and affecting shipping. But apart from the direct COVID factors, Mr. Vice President, the availability and pricing has been driven by flood across the world and continuing still, drought and extreme cold, two extremes in fact. In Brazil, for example, the price of Arabica, which is the most popular coffee, is almost double on the global market, and it has to do with cold. But in another part of Brazil, coffee producing part of Brazil, the issue relates to drought. So it's a combination of different weather factors, excessive water, excessive rainfall leading to flood, lack of rainfall leading to drought, and extreme cold conditions which affect either the startup of planting or the development of whatever is being grown. We are well familiar with the shipping logjam that even as it eases, the expectation is that this logjam could go on for as long as 2 years. Sometimes we forget the impact of wildfires. So on the one hand, in parts of the world, you're fighting excessive rainfall, and on the other hand, in some parts of the world, you're fighting wildfires. And in areas like California and Western Canada, for example, the wildfires over the summer this year really impacted the ability of Western Canada to ship grain from the west to the east coast of Canada, and affected the ability to ship across the world. In California, the impact was the same. What it signals, Mr. Vice President, and what my colleague, Senator Mark, did not make clear, is that it's not simply a matter of ramping up production. We have created the appropriate environment, driven in part by the 500 million stimulus, but also driven by attention to some of the things which existed for a while, including making sure that farmers are paid their subsidies and incentives, focusing on a key motivating factor in agriculture, and that is land leases and land tenure, and all the other things that go towards incentivizing production. But when you look around the country, while we could talk about the imported staples, when you look around the country, from the start of COVID to now, no one can say to me that they've seen shortages in the supply of local fruits and vegetables, except where the availability is seasonal. And that has to do with a very simple but very important measure taken by the government very early in the response to the COVID pandemic. Very early measure was the appointment of several subcommittees of the cabinet, one of which is directly relevant to the topic, and that has to do with a subcommittee chaired by my colleague, Senator Paula Gopi-Skoon, and represented by myself and Minister Ruhan Sinanan, which had to do with what I call the flow of food. And the intention was that that committee, working with the chambers of commerce which were represented on the committee, and working with the supermarkets associations and the representatives of the farmers, would be in a position to identify areas where assistance was needed. And in particular, in respect of assistance on one factor identified by my colleague Senator Mark, port, the clearing of goods and transport of goods across the country during those periods when we've had restrictions, forex, which has been addressed through the Exim Bank and the availability of foreign exchange to those persons who are in manufacturing and who are also foreign exchange earners. The most important thing coming out of that process is the declaration of agriculture as an essential service. And that meant that to this day, our farmers and other food producers have been able to plant, to harvest, to sell, and to put food in the markets. The markets themselves have been open. And in the COVID period, for example, we've been able to launch 3 new farmers markets. And that signals not only the availability of production, but also the availability of consumers to support the markets. And that brings me to that point, Mr. Vice President. What the potential, as the motion identifies, the potential for food shortages really brings us to a very important lesson out of COVID-19. As COVID-19 has developed, we've seen a very clear linkage between the potential effects of COVID-19 and the potential vulnerability of non-communicable diseases. And in response to that, we know that local produce is widely available, and even though we've seen some seasonal increases, we know that prices have been moderate,
2 more minutes.
and in some cases we've seen lower prices compared to previous years. And it tells us, Mr. Vice President, that it is important that in addressing potential food shortages, we have to reduce our dependence on imported food. And at the same time, we are called upon as individuals and as families to pay attention to our personal health and consume what we grow, consume what we know, and support our local farmers. We've heard a lot of times about redeploying CPEP workers and URP workers. I don't think an administration has come in the last, since the NAR introduced taxpayer-funded labor on non-productive agricultural estates. I don't think there's been a time when we've not advocated that. But I'll tell you, the one boost for agriculture in relation to labor has been the availability of the Venezuelan workers. And that, in my view, has saved our farmers and saved our agriculture production. My colleague, Senator Mark, pointed to the port of Port of Spain, and I hope that when the time comes for his support of the efforts to have a PPP arrangement for the port of Port of Spain, that Senator Mark remembers the negative comments he's made about the port today, and he supports the effort of the government to get a private sector partner for that port. And I close by saying that the imposition of increased duties on imported pasta is meant in accordance with the prevailing rules, particularly WTO arrangements, that allows us to protect local jobs, protect local production, and protect a market that exists locally for pasta that we believe that pasta produced here can fill. And we are allowed to do that, and consumers have an option of imported pasta or locally produced pasta. It applies to all those other commodities for which there were price increases consistent with what we are allowed to do under WTO arrangements. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Honorable Senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, December the 7th, at 2021 at 10 a.m. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The Senate now stands adjourned to Tuesday, December the 7th, 2021 at 10 a.m.